Well, welcome to today's webinar on how to see the signs of decline, interpret the numbers, and lead your church towards sustained health. My name is Sean. I'm on the team here at the Unstuck Group and have been for the last 8 years. I'm your host today. And I also have a couple of my teammates joining me for this conversation. First of all, Amy Anderson. Amy's been on the team here at the Unstuck Group since 2015. She currently serves in the role as managing director. During her time here, she served over 200 churches, helping them design ministry, staffing, multi-site strategies that align and fuel their mission. I also have my teammate, Chad Hunt. Chad has been on the Unstuck team also since 2015. He's served well over 200 churches, and in his time here, he's helped churches with strategic planning and leadership development.
Yeah, Sean, I think this is such a great topic that we're covering today. I've recently worked with, or I'm working with, 5 churches that have tested out in the maintenance phase of the life cycle. And they were a little surprised by it when they saw their results. And they were also not surprised by it, meaning that these pastors, they were feeling something in their gut, and that's why they invited Unstuck in. But all 5 of those churches are now working their plans. They're making changes that they need to make to get back to a place of strategic growth or sustained help. So I'm just really hoping today that the things that we share, that they resonate with the churches who are here with us today, and that all of you feel equipped to take some next steps.
Yeah, I love that. Chad, what about your personal experience in helping churches navigate this?
Well, just to mirror what Amy said, it's so common for churches when we engage with them that they're kind of surprised about the whole maintenance phase. But that's what I love about our health assessment, that it just brings this good, clear perspective. And what I've learned about the maintenance phase, especially before we come on site, thankfully, they're wise enough to reach out to us. But it's really a dangerous place to live because people are still attending. Giving is typically still strong. There's money in the bank. People are serving because you've got a lot of Christians in the building. And as a result of that, you don't really feel the pain of it on the front end. So a church can feel like it's healthy just because it feels stable. But we all know that we can't judge church health by only what you see on Sunday.
Yeah.
I actually just experienced this with a church in Missouri. They were holding their own. They were just average. This is very recent. And very quickly in the room during the health assessment, I discovered there was a lot of sacred cows that they were protecting. And, when people live in that room of we've got to protect tradition, we've got to protect sacred cows, that's typically when they start creeping toward that preservation. And when that happens, then keeping people happy becomes the driver, and then vision and mission just take a back seat. And before you know it, they look over their shoulder and they're like, well, what happened?
Absolutely. The conversation around maintenance and decline is always a tough conversation, but there's a lot of reason to have hope today. And we're going to talk about some of those reasons in today's webinar. Chad, Amy, I wonder if you guys could help me just kind of tee up this conversation. Why did we want to address this specific topic right now?
Yeah, well, a lot of churches, they've been experiencing growth over the last few years. Some churches have experienced significant growth, and we know that's not the story for every church out there. But for those churches who are still experiencing growth, while this can be a very fun, challenging, energizing time, you just have to know you haven't probably arrived yet. I don't know if we ever really arrive, but there are likely key next steps you need to be taking so that you can continue to move towards sustained health. So that's why I'm excited to talk about this today.
Well, and the other thing is if your church isn't experiencing growth, but instead the beginnings of what feels like decline, a loss of momentum, or maybe no momentum, there are specific steps you too can be taken right now to move right back towards health. Because the great thing about church, regardless if it's healthy, unhealthy, if it's unhealthy, it can always become healthy because God's the author of it. And when we trust him, follow him, and we do the right planning, God wants the church to be healthy. These 2 phases of the life cycle, maintenance and strategic growth, are mirror opposites of each other. And you need to learn how to recognize all the indicators of each of those next steps that they warrant. If you don't, then once again, you'll find yourself on the wrong side of the life cycle.
So if you've tuned in today, we really want to encourage you to make a specific decision, and that's really just to commit to take action on something that you learned through today's conversation. Warning signs don't do any good if they don't actually drive us towards action. So maybe sit and plan to kind of take notes today with the aim of bringing your senior team, your leadership team together in your next meeting and identifying the steps that your church needs to take towards sustained health together. We're actually going to walk through this conversation in 3 specific sections. Part 1 is going to be all about strategic growth, the indicators that your church is here in strategic growth today, and the next steps towards sustained health. Part two is all about the maintenance phase of the life cycle and the indicators that your church is there in maintenance and whatever next steps then you need to take towards sustained health as well. Part three is going to be about owning your role as the senior leader and helping your church take whatever steps are necessary for the next season in your ministry. A few last details before we get started. If you haven't yet, download the companion workbook for today's conversation. You can find that at theunstuckgroup.com/workbook. We're not doing live Q&A today after the webinar, but Amy and others from our team will be interacting live via chat. And then if you'd like to share some of today's conversation on social media, you can do that either on X, formerly Twitter, or Facebook, and just use the hashtag #UnstuckChurch. All right, let's get into part one on strategic growth. And we'll start here by defining strategic growth and noting kind of the key indicators, warning signs that a church is in this phase of the life cycle. Amy, will you get us started?
Yeah, let's pull up the image of the life cycle and just kind of work our way up really quick. So you can see the first phase there is launch. This is where we start a church, we launch it. You know, the church here is laser focused on reaching new people. They have big dreams for their church. There's very few staff, if any, and there's probably very little money as well. But any church planters on the call today, you remember that launch phase. And then we hope to get to momentum growth. And this is where that flywheel has gotten traction. People are coming, you're trying to make room for them. There's a buzz in the place. It's a high invite culture. People growth is definitely still outpacing giving, but you do have some resources start adding needed staff to the team. You're growing, you're responding to that growth, and you're doing the best you can each weekend to accommodate all the people. And momentum growth is a little bit like people are just starting to come. It's not because you're doing anything specifically to draw them in, they're just showing up. So those are the two phases of the life cycle that precede what we call strategic growth. So strategic growth, this is where churches start to be more intentional. This is where churches are seeing consistent growth in attendance and engagement. And there are a lot of positives in this phase. Giving starts growing as well as numerical growth. There is still a buzz that's happening when you're on this side of the life cycle. There's high energy in the teams, a lot of enthusiasm in the culture. But there's also emerging challenges, like the need for more space and resources, and even more, the need for better systems. It's in strategic growth at this point that you realize either you don't have the systems you need, or the ones that worked through these other phases, they just aren't working anymore. You know, Sean and Chad, looking back, I think the church that I was serving when I was transitioning to this phase, when I actually started on the team, I had watched them for 4 years before that, just as an attender, and they were doing crazy things, right? They were making room for more people and momentum growth. We had services in like multiple areas of the building. They were asking us to move to Saturday night to make room for new people. They were putting on an addition on the existing facility. But I think the addition of my role was part of the work they were doing, because they were like, we need to get organized now. People keep coming and we don't have the systems to do things beyond the weekend very well. And even the weekend, I'm sure, had some cracks. So I came on board as the executive director of weekend services, and we quickly built a small leadership team that was focused on developing the systems that we needed to continue to sustain the type of growth we were seeing. We were regularly projecting out what our church would look like and need to be focused on if we were going to continue to grow at 20% year over year. So we got intentional, again, that's the word, about our plans for growth. We got out in front of the potential landmines that came with growth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Those are some of the things we call the good problems, right?
Yeah.
Those are the good problems.
Yes.
Chad, what are some of the unique challenges that churches face in this phase of the life cycle?
Yeah, so lots of the churches that I serve, including the church that I attend, we've experienced some of this as well. And some of it just keeping up with staffing needs. You know, church growth and hiring additional staff typically go hand in hand, and rightly so, because people are certainly the greatest value of any church. But when churches start experiencing rapid growth, especially that momentum phase, that strategic stage, new needs arise. And the temptation is always to hire doers to meet those needs, hire people to get stuff
Yeah.
done. However, we know at the Unstuck group, and we know that Scripture teaches that church staff should be equippers, enabling the body of Christ to do the work of the ministry. I think it's also important to mention here in growing churches, strategic growth phase, that there is that number that we always use when we serve churches, is that we encourage churches to have a 75-to-1 ratio, one staff member for every 75 people in attendance, which is a healthy ratio. There are exceptions. We've all seen the exceptions, but for the most part, this is a really good metric to live by, because it really does three things. It keeps the church from becoming overstaffed, which in turn encourages a higher level of volunteerism. And lastly, it protects the staff budget ratio, which we encourage 50%, which ensures that vision and ministry are properly financed.
Yeah.
And Sean, the second unique challenge that I often find in churches is just trying to maintain the quality as a church grows, as you try to scale. Oftentimes, growth can overshadow quality. When the church is growing and momentum's happening, every Sunday can feel like a win. I mean, everyone leaves ecstatic, they're excited. However, if someone isn't paying attention to things like hospitality performance, relevant teaching, meaningful, engaging worship experiences, these things can slowly begin to slip away, and before you know it, you're deflating energy and strategic growth. This is true on the weekend, but it's also true in staff performance. As leaders, we have to always pay attention to celebrate the wins, but also have conversations with staff members who aren't keeping up, making sure that as the church is growing, they're ever learning. They're listening to podcasts, they're listening to the Unstuck podcast. That's going to help them grow more than anything.
Can I jump in on that, Chad? I think that's just to pick up on that. There is a reality that the people that start with you may not make it through these phases as the church grows. We all have different levels of leadership capacity. And so I think you were getting at it, Chad, but it's not unusual to get to a point where the responsibility for a leader, it has actually gone beyond their ability. And so I think it's good to have conversations in these other phases, and it's just something we have to pay attention to, because nobody likes to have something that they really don't have the gifting to lead anymore.
Yeah, that's so true.
Yeah, that's good.
I think sometimes the church just outgrows people's leadership skills. And well, Amy, the third one is just preserving culture. We know that culture is such an important part, as the lead pastor says that. And as the church and the staff grow, protecting culture is key. I mean, it's super easy to allow the shiny objects of momentum and growth to distract us from who we are. Healthy culture, I've always said, kind of serves like riverbanks. It keeps everything flowing in the right direction, and it protects that mentality. This is what we do. This is who we are as a staff, as a team.
Yeah.
One of the most important ways to preserve church culture is to celebrate it when it's lived out by staff. Whatever's celebrated gets repeated, and if the church staff lives within the walls of culture, it will certainly cascade to the body of Christ. I'm reminded of a story at the church that I attend. Our children's pastor, I just happened to watch her. She was walking across the parking lot going to the children's area, and there was a piece of trash in the parking lot. She picked it up, she threw it away, and went on about her way. One of our culture shaping behaviors at our church is always make it better. And on that day, she made it better. Wasn't a big deal, but it was a big deal because her authority was exceeded by her responsibility. She's like, it's not my job, but part of our culture. It's who we are. It's what we do. We make it better. And I remember in the staff meeting that following Monday, that we made the biggest, we have a Dundee Award, like from the office. She got the Dundee Award for making it better. And we just all clapped and celebrated it. And when you celebrate that, it really does become embedded in the culture of the church.
Yeah, Chad, I love that story. It's a great example of building culture. What's one of the most common mistakes that you see churches making in this phase?
Well, as the church grows, the reality is systems and structures have to grow with it. Or if not, they're just not sustainability. And leaders sometimes resist adding necessary structure just because they fear they're losing that entrepreneurial spirit. And no one wants to do that. You either stop growing as a leader and try to take your church back to what it was in the early days, or you'll pull out the church planner hat and say, hey, I'm going to go start a church somewhere else. The good news is no one has to do that. Your church really needs your entrepreneurial bent and will benefit from that long run, but your church also needs to make that leadership shift. I've always said to churches, especially growing churches, you have to stop being the lead pastor, and to get to the next barrier, you have to become the leader pastor. Big difference in that. But systems and structures, it seems to always be something that comes last, which is unfortunate. I remember this one church I just served in Detroit not long ago, the Detroit area. It was a great great church. This church, and you all know because we've all done secret shoppers back in the day, it was hard to find anything they were doing wrong. And their worship was stellar. The message was good. They're a new church, and were already running around 400 in attendance. Their communicators were dynamic. Worship was meaningful. It just so many great things happening. But what we learned in our planning time is that they were lacking some structures and systems to sustain that growth.
Yeah.
And when a church doesn't discover a threshold they feel like they can't cross, a barrier they can't break, a lack of the right systems and structure will always result in the absence of sustainability. And by the way, systems and strategies must continually grow with the church the way a skeleton grows with the human body. It's the structure. It's what keeps us together. I just received an email from that same pastor last year. They worked really hard. They implemented the right things, the right systems. And one of the best emails I ever received, he said, hey, I just want to let you know that we're moving forward. And he went on to say, we had to increase our Bible budget because so many people were saying yes to Jesus. We keep running out of Bibles.
Oh, wow.
And so systems aren't just about attendance. I mean, churches need systems for every moving piece, including the options and next steps for people to respond to the gospel. Systems are invaluable when it comes to sustainability, and that's spiritual and physical sustainability.
Okay, let's move on to what specific steps health-minded leaders of churches in strategic growth should be focused on taking to move towards sustained health.
Yeah, let me jump in on this one. There are several critical shifts that churches need to make as they go from strategic growth into sustained health. And the first is they need to shift from personalities to teams. And it doesn't mean that you don't still have strong, charismatic leadership in front of your church, but behind the scenes, the church needs to learn to release and empower others. And at the very top of the organization, they need to begin to build team-based leadership. So really from a person to a team, shift from personalities to team-based leadership. The second thing is, and you've been getting at this, Chad, but they just need to think more strategically. This is that part about becoming more intentional. So there's a shift from being continually reactionary to getting future focused. And I know this is a muscle a lot of churches need because I often get the question, well, then what should we be talking about in our senior leadership team if they aren't talking about the weekend? Okay, so this is a big shift. But what senior leadership teams do is they focus on maintaining alignment. They focus on minimizing complexity. They get clarity around what the core ministry strategies are of the church and building in a process for strategic planning. Those are the types of muscles that are developed at this stage because these leaders develop plans and then they are disciplined and they work those plans, adjusting as they need to. So getting more strategically wired. The third, I would say, and it's related to the last, but when we're talking about minimizing complexity, this is the team that they need to confirm their discipleship path. They need to think through, what is our path? What is the path that we want to point people to so that those folks have the opportunity to look more like Jesus? What are those key next steps? And by doing this, what happens is they curb the tendency for other ministry leaders to just start creating programs and events that keep people busy. Instead, these intentional path steps will be the foundation really for all your ministry strategies. And I'll get into that a little bit more later. But when you have an event, for example, let's say we want to have a women's event. The team is now asking, well, for what purpose? If we do this well, what will the results be? And if, by the way, if those results are just that we have 400 women show up, well, then how is that going to help people take next steps on the path? What is that actually doing, right? Instead, it's like, oh, the purpose of this event is to connect women in small groups coming out of the event. That's a difference from just being random with how we're gathering people to being strategic and pointing towards the path. Because, Chad, you actually have said this so well. When we think about those path steps and you think about discipleship, becoming more like Jesus is a journey. And to be on a journey, there has to be movement. And that movement is your role as church leaders, continuously pointing people to the environments and the steps, the path that's going to put them in the best place to actually experience that transformation. So everything we do as a church, the senior leadership team, is driving towards purpose and alignment with getting people to take their next steps on the path.
That's good.
The fourth one, as we talk about churches moving from strategic growth to sustained health, is that they establish systems to reinforce healthy behaviors. And Chad, you were dabbling in this a little bit. But by systems, I mean defining your day-to-day methods for executing your ministry strategies. So this includes the systems for decision making so that every decision doesn't have to rise to the top. It includes systems that help mobilize more people to be engaged in the ministry instead of just staff members doing that, or just a small group of people carrying it. And it's the systems that help point people, again, towards your discipleship pathway. It's really looking at all the touch points people have with your church and developing the systems to guide them instead of like a singular person. In the book, The Unstuck Church, Tony talks about, at one point the church is like, if you want to serve here, go see Deb. Guess what? When you're 2000, we don't all want to go see Deb. What's our system?
Who's Deb?
Yeah.
Who's Deb? That's right. The fifth one here is that one of the shifts is that structure forms to support future growth. So again, in momentum growth, it was like all hands on deck culture, right? Everybody did everything. We just have to get everything done. But in strategic growth, now we focus on what's the right structure and what are the right roles for us to accomplish this ministry. And so it covers lay leadership, church governance, staff leadership, volunteer ministry teams, volunteer leaders. This is a stage where we are getting clear. This is the role, this is the responsibility, all the way again from our church governance all the way down to our volunteer leaders and volunteers. And just one last one I want to jump in here. They begin to flex their healthy change muscles. So in this stage, as we move to sustained health, we keep our agility. We continue to hold mission above methods, but we don't hold on to the past. We learn from the past, and we continue to initiate change as needed. In fact, the healthy churches that I see in this space that make it to sustained health, change is like an expectation in their culture. They kind of normalize it because the characteristics when you're on the downside is we don't change anymore. So by the way, that might be an indicator that helps you figure out, are we in strategic growth or are we in maintenance? Is your tolerance to change? Because when you're climbing up the life cycle, change is just a normal part of what you're doing.
That is so true. Chad, what's at risk if churches in strategic growth don't make these moves?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I can tell you, and we've all seen it, that it's super easy that a church that's in that momentum growth, that strategic growth, they can get stuck and even skip sustained health altogether before hitting the decline. They just kind of jump over on the other side of the life cycle. And no one ever plans to go there. It's never intentional. I tell churches all the time, it's kind of like Denny's. No one ever plans to go there. We just kind of end up there. Like, why are we here eating? And the same is true with church. It's never intentional. And it seldom ever happens all at once. But what really happens is just neglect. They stop looking at things that are vital to church and ministry. Numbers aren't the most important thing, but if you ever stop looking at them, you'll think they are. Yeah. And usually this starts surfacing when names, tenure, how long someone's been there, what we've always done becomes louder and more important than the mission. In the church, neither people nor ministry should have seniority. Vision and mission should always trump everything. So I think it's almost like going to the doctor for your annual checkup and the doctor looking at you and saying, you know what, you look good, no blood work needed, see you next year. Oftentimes that's what happens when we get in that strategic growth. Things feel so good, we stop looking at the things that matter, what we call the vital signs.
And I think what you said was so good, and I think it bears repeating. I think you said it this way: in church, neither people nor ministries have seniority. Again, I think that's just a concept to sit in for a second. If you're a leader in a church and you're thinking, well, I can change this, but not that, or I can move this person, but not her, because of some of that seniority stuff. Again, that's another yellow flag. It's an indicator we probably don't have the right mindset right now.
Yeah, that's so good. Well, and usually I can tell, when churches begin to live in that stage where, as you said, Amy, some of the people, seniority seems to be the factor about what we do or do not do or change or don't change. Typically when that happens, I also call this the love God stage. And the love God stage, which is really the maintenance stage, it's really, again, as I said earlier, a dangerous place, because what happens is churches unintentionally, no one sets out to do it on purpose, but they just begin to build their ministry models, their language, all their focus on people who already love God.
Sure.
And when that happens, we see a lack of life change.
I think it merits, Sean, putting the graphic back up here. If you look at the life cycle again, because I think, Chad, you actually branded this, but what Chad's talking about is when we're on the right side of this life cycle, that's the love others phase, because that's when we're externally focused and trying to reach people. And as we crest and come over, we're kind of drifting into the love God stage. And by the way, if we don't stop drifting downward, it gets to the love me stage. So I just think that's another good word picture, Chad, that you've helped create here to help people kind of figure out where are we at right now.
The other thing that happens is when churches, when they skip sustained health and begin living on that maintenance side, there are some common factors and just some evidences there. I mean, typically, and I know all of us, we've all seen this, their congregation usually grows older by a generation. As a result, the people who are there who are already Christians, all their friends are Christians, which
Yeah.
disables any kind of invite strategy or invite culture for those outside of faith. Longtime Christians lose speaking permission in the lives of those that have yet to meet Jesus. That's why it's so important to continually reach the next generation and to make sure that we live in sustained health and not allow the buzz and the thrills of strategic growth to, push us from looking at the things that are super important.
That's good. All right, so that is a great overview of the strategic growth phase of the life cycle. We're going to give you just a few moments here to kind of reflect on the 6 shifts that we've shared in your workbook. Which areas do you need to spend some time on specifically? So just take a few moments, maybe make a few notes, and then we'll be back with step 2 on the maintenance phase. All right, now let's look at the maintenance phase in the mirror opposite spot on the life cycle. Amy, what are the warning signs that a church is slipping from a place of health into maintenance?
So the maintenance phase is when a church has lost some momentum and they're experiencing just these subtle shifts that have pulled them out of sustained health. And I think the quote again from the Unstuck Church says it well. In the book, the pastor said, quote, we were experiencing momentum and growth and health. And then all of a sudden we find ourselves on the other side of the life cycle. He said, It snuck up on us, didn't it? Only it's never really all of a sudden. The shift, sort of a crisis of some sort, never really happens in an instant. Instead, here's what I've seen. Churches are typically in the maintenance season for months or even years before they realize it. And as I said earlier, many pastors are surprised when they test out in maintenance. So here are 7 consistent warning signs to be watching for if you're currently in sustained health, but wondering if you've drifted into maintenance. The obvious one is just flattening attendance numbers. And again, it doesn't mean that growth has completely stopped, but it's definitely softened. That is an indicator you might be slipping into maintenance. A second, and it's related, would be a decrease in the number of new visitors, meaning you're seeing fewer new people come through your doors. If you have a way to track it, you're seeing a drop in those numbers. Like, for instance, kids check-in. I know most churches can pull those numbers, that you're seeing those numbers drop. That's another indication that something's wrong with our front door and we're slipping into an insider focus. And that's the third one. The church is becoming insider focused. And, there's a lot of ways I could describe being a church becoming insider focused. But at this stage, I would just say when you're wondering, it's probably a little bit more art than it is science when it comes to recognizing it. And Chad, maybe you'll have some ideas, but it's things like the insider voice is getting louder. So when we're thinking about ministry strategies, or we're thinking about people already connected to the church, when we're designing those, when we're planning events, we're planning it for the people who are already connected to the church. The complaints of our insiders are now holding more sway when we look to make changes in the church, right? If we're going to make a change, all of a sudden it gets a little bit louder. So those would be some of the indications that we're losing this external focus on those outside the faith in the church. So those are the first 3. I've got a few more. Number 4 would be the vision stales. So this would be a season you find yourself in. You're like, there is no clear picture of where God's calling the church. There is nothing that is rallying people's time, resource, and prayer. For the most part, we are just doing church. We're just running the plays. And I think, too, this is a time in a church's season where it starts to become more important how we're doing ministry than why we're doing it. And that's that cooling of the vision. We're getting more focused on how we're doing things than why we're doing it. And
Yeah.
because of this, ministry silos can begin to form. So instead of being this one team that's all pulling in one direction, rallying around this shared mission and vision, ministries begin to value their ministry above the overarching ministry of the church. In fact, I'm working with a church right now, and this was their core issue. Like, they all love one another. They love being in church together, but every day they're just focused on their ministry. They're running their
Sure.
plays. And historically, this church has hired ministry leaders to do that, to be the champion of their
Yeah.
ministry area. Like, you're the men's guy, you're the women's guy, you're the young adults guy. And these ministry leaders are wired that way. And then they are wholly focused on it. But they are very siloed. And this is the headline issue, headline symptom that you're in maintenance. Just two more. Chad, you already said it, but the church becomes overstaffed. If you're looking at your data
Yeah.
and you have more than one FTE for every 75 people at your church, if it's more like 1 to 55, 1 to 50, we're probably in maintenance. If you're spending 55% of your budget or more on staff, we're probably becoming a maintenance church, because the indications are that we're overstaffed. And then the last one, and obviously one, but it's declining the number of people that are coming and crossing the line of faith, right? So there's, whether you count yes to Jesus kind of things or people getting baptized, those numbers are softening or declining as well. So those would all be the top consistent indicators that I see when churches are moving into maintenance.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Chad, what makes this phase of the life cycle so hard for leaders to kind of recognize?
Yeah, and I alluded to it just a little bit earlier, but when you think about this maintenance phase, really it just mirrors the strategic growth phase in so many ways. The differences are very subtle, but there's a lot of things that just mirror each other. For example, your strategic growth in the maintenance phase, most of the time, they'll have an established mission, vision, strategy. People know it. They have strong leaders. They've been doing it for a while. Giving is typically still strong. Both type of churches can look healthy on the surface, and yet when you dig just a little bit deeper,
Yeah.
you'll find a combination of factors to confirm that one is moving towards sustained health while the other has already started to decline. And when I see this with churches, typically what I see is one of the big indicators is when I see churches living in sustained health. And Amy said this earlier. I just love the way she said it, that churches that are growing in sustained health, it's almost an annual rhythm that we know we're going to have to continue making changes. And when churches find themselves, they can have all the right pieces, like we just talked about, giving leaders, but they become very change averse. And when they become change averse, they become opportunity averse. And then all of a sudden they find themselves mistaking stability for health. They think just because people are showing up, people are singing, they're giving, that we're healthy. The church can still be financially stable. Programs can even be running smoothly. In fact, it can be one of the most financial stable seasons for the church ever. It may even be a season where giving is increasing. But the reality is there's often a fear of acknowledging the reality of the situation. And because pastors, and we all know this, that change and growth are synonymous. You can't have one without the other. And when churches start living in that maintenance phase, even though some of the pieces are there, some of the big rocks are there that feels like stability, that feels like health, when we stop changing, we stop growing. And it's impossible to have one without the other. And so leading through change is just something that it always, always follows churches that land in, well, the lack thereof, follows churches that land in that maintenance phase.
Okay, Amy, so what are some of the specific steps that pastors need to take to move their church out of maintenance?
Yeah, if you kind of are hearing some of these symptoms and you're like, I think we're there, here's a couple of key next steps for you. The first one, if you follow us, we're going to say this. It's just assessment. You need to start by conducting just an honest assessment of where you're
We
at
say
today.
it because it's true.
It is true. Take the Unstuck Vital Signs assessment. Look at your data and see what it's telling you. Take the Unstuck Church assessment, see what it's telling you, and then evaluate your church against those warning signs I just walked through and answer honestly, how are we doing in this? When we do this with the church, we do run those two objective assessments. And then we lead the team through 3 to 4 hours of what I would call subjective conversations, just talking about where the church feels healthy right now, where it feels stuck, what questions are out there, what might be missing. And it's a conversation where we're not trying to solve anything. That's the important thing. We're not trying to solve anything or come to conclusions or decisions. We're just trying to figure out what our starting line is, because it's so important to do this assessment before you start taking action. And so you need confirmation on what the true issues are. And between these objective assessments, subjective, you've circled them out in a few times, and you just start to find some clarity. We see it every week on the ground with churches. So that would be the first step. The second priority step would be to prioritize reaching new people. So regardless of how well you think you're doing it right now, this needs to come back under the spotlight. And when I say reach new people, I'm talking specifically people outside the church and outside the faith. And maybe I don't need to say that, but there's a church near me. And in a conversation, a person was sharing, like, I heard they're growing. And upon further investigation, and I was thinking this, it's growing because they are a church that attracts people who leave other churches. So that's not what I mean when I say prioritize reaching new people. But what I do mean is trying, truly rebuilding an outward focus at your church. So that means clarifying what your primary reach strategies are and putting them under the microscope to see what needs to be done to improve them. So for most churches, the weekend service is their main strategy to reach new people. So look at your language, look at your service length. Is it understandable? Is it relevant? Is it excellent? Is it worth people outside the church and the faith giving an hour to it? Or should I maybe say a second hour, right? They're already there, so they're going to give you an hour, but they're going to be evaluating the whole time. Will I come back? And sometimes this can be hard for us when we're insiders to evaluate it well. And so part of what I would also put in with prioritizing reaching new people, I would just look at yourself and your leadership team and ask the question, when's the last time I invited someone to church? We hit this at our church, and all of a sudden we were all like, it had been a year. It had been a year since any of us on the executive team had invited. And so that would probably make it a more meaningful conversation for you all to start to invite and start to see your church through an outsider's eyes again. And the second piece of that would be just on the digital side of things. So thinking about like your website, that's often a primary strategy that new people interact with. And so is it voice to the outsider or the insider? Is it easy to find the information that we need? So just do an audit. And again, the point here was to prioritize reaching new people. The third, if you haven't already, move from ministry programs, to a discipleship pathway. And I think I mentioned this on the podcast series we did on this, but I'm with the church right now that's working on doing this work, and they are going through all of the events on their calendar right now. And there are many, and they're doing the hard work. They're listing them all out. It's funny. They're even like, I didn't even know we did that. That ministry started 40 years ago. I thought we didn't have it anymore. But they're seeing all the activity that their team is doing, and they're working to determine what their actual path is, instead of investing in all these miscellaneous programs and events. So for many churches, the path is something like come to the weekend for great biblical teaching, and then find your place to serve, use your gifts, get connected with other people in community, often through a small group strategy, invite others to church, and be generous. So those are just a sample of 5 of the very popular components of a discipleship pathway. But when you have those clear steps designed, then everything you do should be pointing to that. Like I gave the women's event earlier. How does it connect to the step? And then just one more, reprioritize resources around new initiatives. So again, once you know the key steps you need to take to get back to a place of sustained health, then organize the work into initiatives, like name them, build teams around them, and then resource them so that you can actually accomplish what they're set up to accomplish.
Sure.
Just as an example of this, we worked with a great church in Tallahassee, Florida, a few years back. And when we started with them, they were in maintenance phase. And during their ministry health assessment visit, I highlighted kind of the datedness and the darkness of their auditorium. It was kind of like stepping back in time. I had been outside for their, guest services, their kids' space. Everything was great. But then I stepped back in time. The area was pretty cluttered. It didn't really feel like this go-to place. It felt dark and worn down. And out of their planning time, they came out with 3 initiatives. And one of them was to focus on strategies to reach more people, The second was to clarify their discipleship pathway. So that should confirm a little bit, like churches that are in maintenance, these are the things they need to focus on, because
Yeah.
they had to do some pruning. And third, to work on some leadership development. And this is a team, they just got after it. But my example is related to their initiative to reach more people. They invested $500,000 out of that engagement to renovate their worship center. And that's what I'm saying about rallying your resources to support your initiatives. I mean, it's so fun. 2 years later, I just went back through my emails today as I was prepping for this. They were celebrating their largest Easter ever, 2 years. When we started with them, they were averaging 350 in weekend attendance. 2 years later, Easter drew 2,800 people to their church.
Oh my gosh.
Amazing. It's so good.
I could talk for 10 more minutes about the other results they're seeing. It's amazing. But these guys got a plan, and then they worked and they invested in those plans. And so that's the action related to this. You said earlier, warning signs are one thing. Knowing where you're at is another thing. But the key is to take some of these next steps and get moving towards getting out of maintenance.
That's good. All right. So for you, those of you tuned in today, in your workbook, we want to give you just a moment to take some time and reflect. Is your church likely in this maintenance phase of the life cycle? And if so, what's jumping out at you as your priorities for discussion with your team going forward? So again, just a couple of seconds here, write down in your workbook, capture your thoughts right now, and then we'll be back with step 3.
On earth as it is in heaven.
Give God the glory, all right, shine. Give God the glory. All right, shine. Give God the glory, right, shine. Give God the glory, right, shine. Soldier.
We got a runner.
Shake up, ladder. We are climbing. Oh, we are climbing. Soldier, we are climbing.
All right, let's talk about the senior leader's role in all of this. Chad, what specific responsibilities does the senior leader have in moving the church towards health?
Yeah, such a great question. It's funny, Sean, so often, I mean, I will probably say more times than not, when I talk to a church about engaging with this, there's usually always one question. They're like, are you sure this is going to work? Like, is there a silver bullet? And while there isn't, there is one thing that's a must, and that's that the senior leader must be invested. You know, the lead pastor has to be completely bought in. I've never seen a church that did well where that didn't happen. So he has to be the primary champion for change. He has to be the leader for that. And I think, you know, the leader as the senior pastor, that leader's role has to have that personal conviction about the state of the church. We always say that when churches need to change, when churches need a different directions, leaders usually always see it first. And that's just a heart thing. They understand we have to do something different. And then that results in them creating some urgency around the mission, just putting their focus on the right things. In addition to that, just building alignment among key stakeholders, making sure they're bought in, that they're vested in that. They model adaptability and learning, so they set the pace for that. They maintain focus on long-term health over short-term comfort. And, you know, the leader has to walk in those shoes. I was just thinking about it. One of the churches I served in Seattle. In this church, you know, and if you're watching the webinar and you have a traditional and a contemporary and whatever that looks like for you, in this particular church, their contemporary was growing, their traditional was not. During their planning time, they decided to change the traditional to contemporary. Well, we all know what that's like if you've ever worked in a church like
Yeah.
that. That's a hard task.
Super
And
easy,
so,
super easy.
yeah,
Everyone loves
yeah.
that change.
I think it's easier to get Congress to vote something new in than that. But the lead pastor owned it. I mean, usually the lead pastor is the one, he's worried because usually your traditional service have your older people who have all the money. Your contemporary have the younger people who have no money. And there's always that conversation.
Hmm.
And so the lead pastor he really owned it. I'll never forget him pulling me to the side and said, this is the direction I feel like we need to go. They needed space to grow. They needed to see life change at both services. They just weren't seeing that. But I love this because they developed a clear vision, a communication strategy to ensure that everything, including the worship style change, was tied not to a preference or a person, but the mission of reaching people for Jesus. And when the lead pastor has that voice, the lead pastor's voice has more weight than any other voice on the team and in the church. He's the culture setter. And when he doesn't have buy-in, it just doesn't work well. But when he does buy in, when he's walking in confidence, when he's leading the charge, we're going to go after this or die trying, man, that just becomes contagious among the team.
I love that. Amy, what are some of the practical steps that senior pastors can take to build buy-in for these necessary changes that are coming?
Sure. The headline for me is brushing up on change management. Chad, I think that was one of the first things you said. They have to be the primary captain of change. And so
Yeah.
if that's something that you've learned, but you haven't brushed up on in a while, I would do that. One of my favorite resources on this topic is called The Change Cycle by Ann Salerno and Lily Brock. Another staple is Leading Change by John Cotter, or a classic read, one of my favorites, Who Moved My Cheese? These are all books about change, and they all have the same concepts in them, and they just put some tools in your tool belt. Because bottom line, never underestimate the power that change has on any organization, even positive change. So under that umbrella, this is nothing new under the sun. Here's a few reminders. You have to consistently communicate the why behind the changes. You have to be focused on the why. That's what's going to change people's hearts. That's what's going to be compelling. You have to invest in your key leaders and influencers. In Cotter's book, they talk about, who you need to bring in first, who next. And so thinking through that strategic plan as you're initiating change. You need to share and celebrate wins and progress regularly, especially wins early on. I would guess, Chad, in the church that you were sharing when they moved to one style of service, they were sharing some great stories of new people connecting to the Lord through that. That's what helps move people. You need to create opportunities when you're leading change for feedback and dialogue. This is a great example of this. This is more internal. This is like staff communication, but I've mentioned the Bayou Church before. But they went through a big restructure, and out of that, they just created a new way to create opportunities for feedback and dialogue by creating what they call fireside chats, where staff could just ask very transparent, anonymous questions. And the leadership, got the questions and very thoughtfully went through it. I think they did it once a month. Now they're doing it more quarterly or less. There's more trust and transparency built in. They're past the change now. But get creative about ways that you can get feedback and get dialogue coming. And build trust through transparency. And this probably goes beyond the staff. It really goes to the congregation. I was just talking to a church this week. They have some big changes. And we were talking about how it's okay to share with your congregation what you're seeing and sensing. They want to hear that from their leader. They want to be invited in on the challenges that the church is facing, because they need help seeing what you see, because that's part of the why you're making the change. So transparency is helpful.
That's all really helpful, Amy. And I think what else is helpful is you recently had a conversation with a pastor who's been navigating some of the very things that we've been discussing here today. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, we just have a short interview with Pastor Jeff Huber. He is the lead pastor at Summit Church in Durango, Colorado. I've actually been working with him and the team for the past 4 years. They're great friends now. But when I started with them, they were in the maintenance phase. And this past year, when we refreshed their plans, they're all the way over into strategic growth, heading towards sustained health. So I just asked him some questions as a pastor who has had to identify where are we and how do we swing back to the other side of that life cycle, just to hear a little bit about his story. So here's my conversation with Jeff. Well, Pastor Jeff, I'm so excited to have you on the webinar today. You and I, we've been walking arm in arm for about 4 years now, I think it is, out in Durango, Colorado. But I wanted our listeners today to hear your story. So can you back it up 4 years ago? How long had your church been experiencing signs of being in the maintenance phase when you finally started to recognize what was going on?
Well, first, thanks for inviting us. It's an honor to be a part of the journey with you in terms of Unstuck and what that means. But I would say, we connected with you during the pandemic, really.
Mm-hmm.
And really, we decided our leadership team had gotten together and said, we want to be better and not bitter coming out of COVID. And it really provided opportunity also to do some things and to make some changes. And I think probably 3 or 4 years at least before that, it had become clear to me that we were kind of stagnant. We'd actually hired another coach. We worked with I've always had a coach, and I had a coach for a while that worked great. We did a name change, and he really helped with that. And there were some really great things that happened. But then we kind of got stagnant again, and then COVID hit, and we were like, okay. And especially we were looking at like children youth ministry had really kind of taken a dive, partly because we'd had some staffing issues, but partly because we just weren't paying attention. I think what I kind of learned is you have to pay attention to certain things. We're in a denomination, and we have stats we have to measure. And so we keep track of those. But there are some stats that, like our denomination, don't ask us to keep that Unstuck does, which have been really helpful. And so I just think part of it is I kind of live by the mantra, facts are our friends. And so it took us a while to go, okay, when we look at the facts, there are some issues here. We need to really be willing to deal with them.
As you look back at your journey, Jeff, so, 4 years ago, you were in maintenance. Today, you're in strategic growth. As you look back at your journey, what were some of the first things you did that you noticed they're starting to move the needle? We're starting to move in the right direction.
One of the things I do appreciate, I should say this, is that you didn't spend a lot of time with us on like a mission statement and all that. Your kind of assumption is church's mission statement. It's the Great Commission, the Great Commandment, which is kind of what we've said for years here. Love God, love others, share the good news. And so that just became our mantra. It's something we had said anyway. Okay, that makes sense. But the thing that really helped, I think, was being clear. Okay, here's the mission field. Here's the people that live around us. And it's clear, at least for us where we live in Durango, Colorado, there were a couple of different groups we knew we were going to connect with if we were doing our job at all. Probably one of the first things that was so helpful was naming very clearly our mission field is this. And then what really began to happen was we began to run everything through that filter of how is it that this will help us reach our mission field. And I'll be honest, there were several things that were in the pipeline. We were going to start some new things that we said, we're not doing that. That doesn't help us with our mission field. So we just cut those things out. A number of things. And this was a little bit easier for us coming out of COVID. We just had some things where like, let's not bring that back. It's not helping with our mission field, And so right now our big problem is we're out of room. One of our new initiatives is a make room initiative because we don't have enough room in our current space. Durango is a smaller community, so it's not like a place where you can build a monstrous sanctuary. So we know that people move here to have something smaller. So we know that but we know that's our target group too.
Right.
Our target group has said that to us, said that, really looking for this. And so I think that is probably when we began to see the flywheel turn and really today, even people bring me stuff and I'm like, well, that's a nice idea, but if you want to do it, fine, but that's not going to be something our staff spends time on.
I watched you guys get laser focused on your mission. I have seen the way you have transformed your building, which of course is just a tool. It's just a strategy, right, to serve your mission field. But when did you really, go back to when we first started our first meeting? How long did it take before that flywheel started to move for you?
One of the things that has changed here is when you first walk into our building, there was like a Wesley parlor and a library and a little coffee area. And we had our next gen team said, could we blow out this space and do something radically different with it. And that was one of our first projects. And it has transformed our building. Quite frankly, you walk in every weekend and it is packed with young families and kids. And we have a group of young adults that said, look, we want to start making breakfast for people. So they make breakfast for people. And it's just become this community building center hub. And none of that would have happened if it weren't for us really thinking about our mission field, having initiatives that really focused on that. And so once that got going and turning, we used to do outreach events, different kinds of things. And now, like, we have a creative team that met and they said, okay, what would really reach our mission field? That was their conversation this last year. So this last year they did a harvest festival and a spring fling instead of an Easter egg hunt. Mm-hmm. And we had literally hundreds of people in our mission field that don't go to our church show up in our parking lot that were here. Many of them came to worship. We still have many of them connecting now. But those are things that we probably wouldn't have. We have time, bandwidth now to do those things, mm-hmm. because what we do now is we say, well, that reached the mission field. And so we don't do some of the things we used to do, and we're doing things like that instead.
Some of the folks who are engaging with our webinar today, they're in maintenance phase. And what wisdom can you share with them who find themselves in maintenance today and they need to lead some of those big changes?
I think the first thing I would encourage them to do personally, and this is the thing I had to do very early on in ministry, to really ask myself, who's the church for? Is it for me? Is it for the people already here? Or the reality is the church is the only institution ever designed for the people who aren't in it. I think C.S. Lewis said that, G.K. Chesterton. And so it starts in some ways with us as the leader going, I care about the people outside there as much as I care about the people inside. It's not that I don't care about the people inside. I care about them too, but I care about those who are outside at least as much as those inside. And then what I've learned is you can't lead where you haven't been. So we have to focus we did a lot of work around emotionally healthy spirituality here over the years to help ground us, mm-hmm. so that we could, I think, not be anxious. Because I think the biggest problem when you're initiating, nobody likes change unless it's their idea. And the biggest problem for those who are leaders is we get anxious, especially if we're people pleasers like I am and most pastors are. We're like, we get stuck because we're like, oh no, I don't want to offend this group or that group. And that's what starts to creep in when we're not grounded. Mm-hmm. So I think the first thing is to do that is to work on ourselves first and ask ourselves, honestly, are we willing to lead, are we willing to go to this place? Mm-hmm. Because I think a lot of people want to reach maybe a mission field they aren't reaching, or especially like a big thing is young families. We want to do that. But we aren't necessarily always willing to do the work that it takes, whether it's our preaching and our teaching and all the things we're doing, because that needs to shift too. That had to shift for us too a little bit. So I think that'd be the first thing is to really ask yourself, am I ready? Am I willing? Do I have the bandwidth? Do I have the energy? Am I willing to stop doing something so I can start doing this? So that's the first. The second is to be honest about your measurement, is to, one of the things. So I encourage a number of churches to use the Unstuck assessment, and you probably have experienced this, but I can't believe the number of people that take the assessment and then their pastor takes it and it's totally different. Usually the pastor sees what's really happening and the people in the church are like, oh, it's great, da, 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 da. And so once again, part of it is being grounded so that, you can really deal with the facts of where your church is at, mm-hmm. that we are in maintenance or in preservation or whatever place we are in the life phase of the church, mm-hmm. because sometimes people in it can't always see it. And so I think I've also learned that finding a loving way to share that information with them is helpful, mm-hmm. like to make it clear, hey, I love you, I care about you, and we can't stay where we are. Mm-hmm. The church isn't just for us. It's for, your kids, your grandkids, the people in our community. Mm-hmm. I think the final thing I would say around that is to be really clear once you figure out what your mission is, that one of your main jobs is to help the church stay focused on it, because mission creep happens so easily. And I've had, I don't know how, as the church has started to grow, I get all kinds of people coming to me with all kinds of great ideas. They're awesome, but they're not in our mission field. They don't, and we've had to say, hey, that's a great idea. Whatever we can do to help you, fine, but you need to go do that, because this is where we're going to be focused right now.
Well, Amy, Chad, this has been a great conversation today. Hopefully it's been helpful for our viewers as well. Any final thoughts before we wrap up this webinar?
Yeah, I think we started this way. Just remember that every church goes through these phases. And the key is really to recognize where you are so that you can identify what are the intentional next steps we have to take towards health. And for those who are sensing that you're in maintenance, I also just want to say facts are your friends. This isn't the time for head in the sand. Don't wait until decline is obvious to take action. Know your data, know what it's telling you. Just want to encourage you to get proactive, take the steps you need to get healthy. We see churches do it all the time, and it's absolutely amazing what God redeems and how fun it is once we move through some of that hard work. And then for those of you in strategic growth, just don't stop now. Don't assume what you're doing today that's led to the growth will sustain you indefinitely. Get your ministry systems in order, anticipate the changes that you need to make as you grow. Make sure that discipleship path is clear so that you and the team can really pull together to get to that sustained health.
Yeah, I guess the thing I would say, I've said to pastors oftentimes that sometimes leading a church is like starving to death in a grocery store. It's like you know
Mhm.
what to feed everyone, and you just can't, and you don't know what you don't know. And so I just want to remind all of the pastors and leaders that have tuned in with us on this webinar is that you're not alone in the journey.
Mhm.
We all have our gift set, we all have our skill set. We're here to serve. Many churches face these same challenges. One of the most common mistakes I feel like churches make is they treat what's normal as abnormal. And when churches are growing, they're going to go through these things, and there's resources out there and support available to help lead pastors through all of these phases and stages. And so just be encouraged that, God has people for you.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for tuning into today's webinar. Really appreciate you taking the time to join us for this conversation. Just as a reminder, we'll share the replay of this webinar in the coming days. So you'll get a link in your email if you'd like to watch this again or share it with others on your team or another church leader that you know that's not even a part of your church. We would appreciate you doing that. We work with churches on a weekly basis that are in strategic growth, in maintenance, and navigating the challenges around those seasons. So if we can do anything to help you and your church, you can reach out to us at theunstuckgroup.com to start a conversation. Once again, thank you, and we'll see you on a future webinar.